Good evening, welcome, and hello. It's 7 o'clock, so I am going to get started. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jay Delacave, and I'm a visiting assistant professor here at Brown University's Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies, and I'm the host and event moderator for tonight. And I'm going to take a couple of minutes as you settle in to welcome you to Activating Deconstructions in Dance and Performance, an artist talk and Q&A with interdisciplinary artists Sara Jimenez and Zavé Martohardjono. First off, I wanted to give a few thank yous. First to Brown's Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies, and also to Brown's Arts Initiative for their support of this event. And an extra big thanks to Chris at TAPS and Sean at the BAI, who were just assisting us moments ago with the technical support of this event. I also wanted to thank my virtual audience. I'm so pleased to see the names of friends, students, and colleagues joining us from near and far during this super strange and also quite terrifying moment. I extend my sincere wishes that you and your loved ones are and remain safe and healthy during this time. So the nuts and bolts, there's going to be 3 segments to this event. First, Zavé will talk about their work, followed by Sara talking about her work, and lastly, there'll be a Q&A. Throughout the event, if you toggle down to the bottom of your screen, you can submit questions for either of the artists that they will answer during the 3rd segment. We're hoping this event to be very concise, 1 hour long, and it is being recorded live, quote unquote, now, and an edited version will be available on the BAI's website, Artists at Home. So the title of our artist talk this evening is Activating Deconstructions in Dance and Performance. And we came up with this title when this event was initially scheduled for the week before our spring break, which, as you know, was the week that massive shutdowns and quarantines began for many cities here on the East Coast. A month later, the world seems to be deconstructing itself, and amidst all of the death and sorrow, chaos and transition, I'm moved that these and other artists persist in their transformative world makings, and couldn't be more pleased to be presenting 2 of them here tonight. I also want to assert at this moment that embodied practices, performance, and interdisciplinary arts may have more to offer us now during this time of crisis than during, again, quote unquote, normal times. So some thoughts about tonight's guests. In my role as educator, dance scholar, dancer, and performance maker, I've recently been thinking a lot about the ways that certain interdisciplinary artists employ their bodies. Coming from a hefty dance background, it's no surprise that I have an interest in centering the bodily aspects of interdisciplinary performance work, but my interest extends quite far beyond aesthetics, spatiality, qualitative factors, what parts of the body are moving, and how, if any of my students are listening, in other words, the movement descriptions that you have due in your final papers. And instead, I'm struck by how artists such as Sara and Zavé employ their bodies as a powerful medium to comment on large, ongoing, never-ending traumas and hardships of the world. I'm compelled by how, through their embodied capacities, these artists transform histories by engaging with, undoing, and producing multiple identities through fraught and violent past. They visibilize, deconstruct, remake, and transform our racist, heteropatriarchal, colonialist histories, and in turn transform themselves, transform our perceptions, and transform us. This process is what I like to call how bodies and embodiment can make history and hegemony a little more unstuck. It also points to how our bodies themselves are actual material substance of histories. I'm going to say that again. They also point to how our bodies themselves are actual material substances of history. And in the contemporary moment, these bodies cause the past and present to collide and proffer portals for change. These bodies that I speak of are also wonderful people in the world that I'm so very honored to be in community and practice with, Sara and Zavé. Lastly, I just want to wish everyone a happy May Day and a shout out of solidarity to the striking workers and an acknowledgement of the important labor of performing artists, especially during these precarious times. Zavé and Sara, I sincerely and deeply thank you for your labor in addressing the mechanisms that oppress us and for opening up spaces for contemplation, reflection, relief, healing, and equitable futures. So with that, I invite you to sit back, relax, and relish, and I will pass the video screen to Zavé.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's really a pleasure to share my work with everyone, and I've so enjoyed all these conversations we've been having over the past few months about what we want this talk to be about, and we've been finding these really sweet intersections, and it just reminds me of how much resonance there is among creatives and how we make things always as a sort of collective body, collective mind. So thank you, and thank you to the Theater and Performing Arts Department at Brown for giving us and having this space for us as well. I want to share a few things about a performance series that I've been working on for the past few years, since 2018. The umbrella title of this project is called Territory. There have been many different iterations that are site responsive to the cities and places where they happen. And I actually just wanted to start with just watching a 3-minute clip of myself and Raha Behnam performing an iteration called Territory Mystic River. It happened in Medford, Mass at Tufts University this past October. So I'm going to set myself up so that we can watch that together. Oh dear. Okay, hold on one second. There's a little tech issue. 1 second. Let me know if you can hear. No, can't hear. Yikes. Okay, I think it might be that audio setting that I just put on Zoom. I'm sorry, 1 moment. I'm gonna switch back to the setting. Okay, let's try. Okay, let's try that again and let me know if you can hear.
Here, here, to here. There's an island. There are 2 sides of the island. There is an island. The island was split in half. Right down the middle. White lines carved in straight angles by white hands. On one side live all the brown people. On one side live all the brown people. On one side live all the brown people. On live all the people who do not think they are brown anymore. On both sides, same cheekbones, same eyeballs, same creaking knees. There is an island. The island was split in half. On one side, history as you know it. On the other side, the land speaks very clearly. But only some listen. Only some speak back. The land speaks. But some of us deny, become sick, stop feeling in our bodies. So thirsty. So hungry. The land sees, the land speaks, the land sings. What does the land say?
So that's a clip, and then I'd love to just show some images of a different iteration that happened. Let me just set that up real fast. All right, should be good, yeah. So I'm going to talk through this as I show some images. This iteration that I'm showing images of is an installation that was activated with performance. And that happened thanks to curator Tarane Fazeli, who brought me to the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts as part of a show. As I sort of show you some of these images, I'm going to talk to you about this performance. So this performance is a live work that has been shared in different iterations. So it's been performance, theater, ritual dance, and in this case, activation of installation. And at the center of the series is this parable about a fictional island that has been split by a colonial border. And on one side of the island is sort of the world as we know it, those of us who survive daily inside of colonized and hyper-capitalist realities. So that is a society that is divided by racial constructs and that come from a colonial legacy, a society that is rife with socioeconomic inequity, and a society that essentially is at war with itself. On the other side of the island, inside of this parable, is something entirely different. It's another reality. It's home to a community who has resisted invasion and capitalism. And this quote unquote other side is thriving culturally and environmentally autonomous from empire. But this other side and those powers are unrecognized by the global community. So I've been doing this piece as a solo for most of its time, and recently have been starting to work in collaboration with artists Raha Behnam, Ube Halaya, and a dramaturg, Elaine Carberry. And we're in this embodied process, really sort of trying to tell the full story and create the story of this island, and focusing on the quote unquote other side. And we're also really working to contextualize this performance inside of current events, which, you know, at this point, we find ourselves inside of a global pandemic. So I appreciate sort of the chance to talk about activation tonight, because I think that the ways that we're working together are really activations. We're conjuring, we're divining our material. It's a facilitated process. It's a collective process. It's a multivocal process, and it's different from working in a way where you're putting your story or your performance onto other people's bodies as a choreographer. So I'm not sort of engaging in that that kind of direction. I think in this exploration of this sort of other side of this fictional island, we sort of have this opportunity to explore alternative history and also an invisible history. So we're creating from the other side, and that gives us this opportunity to kind of research, but also to remember our own Western Asian and Southeast Asian cultures and mythologies, those of my collaborators and I, and to look into and research indigenous and non-Western technologies that produce sustenance and sustainability and longevity, so things that are opposite to hypercapitalism. And the island is fictional, but our research is not. It's actually coming from living histories. We're actually looking at technologies and histories that have been employed and that are keeping us alive today. At the same time that it's real, it's also speculative. So I think of this other island, or this other side of the island rather, as a space to imagine what world we can create and what worlds we are creating right now, outside of failing colonial and capitalist society. And I think what's so interesting right now about being in the midst of a global pandemic is that we're really seeing the reality. So we're seeing the failures of healthcare and government and social systems in one of the richest countries in the world, in the US. We're seeing also these indigenous technologies being adopted by Western society, mutual aid networks and communities sharing resources, and neighbors really coming out of the woodwork just to help each other out, right? So I'm thinking right now, as Raha and Ube and Elaine and I are sort of lengthening this work, we're making a full-length piece to premiere at Give Me Dance in the fall. I'm thinking about how right now in the midst of the pandemic, it's almost like the two sides of this island are alive, right? They're sort of in conversation. And I wonder if different people are gonna survive the pandemic in different ways because we're on one or the other side of the island. So, you know, some folks right now are on that colonized side where they're more concerned about businesses reopening than preventing deaths. And others of us are on the side of the island that are figuring out how to stay afloat by engaging in resilient technologies and premising collective care over personal needs or, you know, personal value. This project has really given me a chance to think about how to work with the invisible and the unacknowledged, and what it looks like to reframe or deconstruct, you know, capital H history. And these are big and kind of painful, but also really joyous questions that are coming up for my collaborators and I. I want to talk a little bit about some of the questions that are coming up. You know, how do we do this research? We're looking at, that's the last image, yeah. We're looking at mythologies from our different ethnic lineages to create characters that we will perform as, and the performances are improvisational, and are very responsive and ritual-based. And so in the process of us looking at respectively our Indonesian and Filipinx and Iranian lineages and the mythologies that come from those cultural lineages, we're finding that we're having trouble figuring out what does it mean to research. So, you know, questions are coming up like, how do we research when what we're looking for doesn't come up in a Google search? And when some of the texts that we have available to us are anthropological texts, which means that it's interpretations of culture, it's interpretations of ritual dance, it's interpretations of mythology from a Western perspective, which, you know, means it could be misconstrued, right? It could be misunderstood. What does research mean when what we're looking for is conveyed outside of language? If it's not written history, but oral history, how do we find the people who know the stories? And what does it mean to sort of look at, you know, community-based resources? We were talking a little bit about this, Sarah. You know, when community-based resources or the histories that we document for ourselves might actually be considered illegitimate in comparison to the encyclopedia or the textbook, right? So I think, you know, these questions kind of bring up a lot of possibility and a lot of creative generation, and also a lot of trauma and pain. Raha and Ube and I have been talking about, you know, what it means to work inside of gaps, absences, voids. And I think for me personally, it brings up this pain of assimilation and sort of the violence of colonialism. that when I research my own culture, which in this case, I'm looking at the Balinese demon queen named Rangda, and I'm using her as a basis for the persona that I perform as. It can be very painful for me, right, to look at my own culture, Indonesian dance theater, as if from an outside perspective, because I grew up here in New York and Canada, so in North America. And I think what's coming up for me emotionally is I'm sort of encouraging myself and my collaborators to really trust that we are connected by blood and spirit to these stories, that we don't have to see them to know them, that we can remember them as well as, formally research them. And that for me, this is sort of an opportunity to sort of grapple with the psychology of being assimilated, of the self-doubt that comes from being mixed race, for example. Really fighting the internalized colonizer that tells me that I don't know. And I think in that sense, activation, ritual process, story circles, sharing, divination, kind of getting into the room together with our stories and our intuitions and really seeing what plays out and making performance from that place, for me feels both an intellectual endeavor, right, of like putting these stories out there in the world and self-education, but also a really personal and emotional endeavor of affirming myself. And I'm really grateful to be in this super multivocal process now with my collaborators. We're seeing some themes come up in some of the mythologies that we are researching together. And I want to name some of those things. So some of the things that we've learned about in recent weeks is an Iranian myth about a mythical bird, the Simurgh, who represents a collectivized power. We're also looking at a pre-colonial Tagalog goddess, Anagalai, who is the goddess of all lost things and all lost people. And I'm working with this figure of Rangda, who's very powerful. And in the story of Rangda is that in response to injustice, she brings pandemics upon villages. So the dance of Rangda, as I'm understanding it, is also a collective and communal and village dance to process healing from a pandemic. And having recently come across that in my research, it really sort of affirmed to me that, that the signs sort of come out when you need them. And we're doing this work not just to sort of deconstruct or reconstruct or reorient around history and past, but actually, yes, those cycles of history repeat themselves. And so right now we are in the midst of something that I think we do as a, whatever, it's a corny thing, like a global village, right? We need to process this together. And so this sort of question that I've been thinking about in recent weeks, especially as now our creative process is really considering the pandemic and considering what our lives look like right now, I'm thinking about how to imagine a history of this island, of that other half of the island, from some of the technologies and cultures that we're seeing sprout up today, across the globe. And also, I'm wondering, what if the culmination of this project that I've been working on for 2 years, this ritual dance that the three of us will do together in the fall, what if it becomes some sort of multivocal version of our community dance to process this pandemic and our community dance to sort of forge our resilience together? Yeah, thank you so much for listening. And I'm really happy to share this work with everyone.
Thank you so much, Zavé. And now we'll turn our attention to Sara. For those of you who are watching, just a reminder, we can take questions now and we'll address them during the Q&A. There is a little box marked Q&A right down below your screen that you can click on at any time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay, for allowing this to be possible via Zoom. And thank you so much, Zavé. it's been really a spiritual and intellectual oasis to have these kinds of weekly conversations that have sort of culminated out of the pandemic. Because originally we were scheduled a month or so ago, and with everything shifting and Jay making it possible for us to be on Zoom, I feel like we formed this mini community, and the conversations have just been like water in a desert for me. I've just really, really loved them. And Zavé, it was such a thrill to learn more about your work. I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint. All right. So I'm going to focus on I'm going to focus on a body of work that really came to fruition between 2018 and 2019. And I'm going to start by looking at a couple of these textbooks that I've been researching. A lot of my process, my practice has been focused on how to deconstruct, oopsie. Sorry, technical issues. Okay, how to look at the history of where my family is from in the Philippines, which, and looking at a very specific time period, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And as Zavé mentioned, a lot of the histories that have been acknowledged, particularly in Southeast Asia, are from this very colonial lens. And so I've been taking these anthropological propagandistic textbooks that have been written around the 1800s, early 1900s by the US and by Spain, and looking at the photos and texts that are in the books themselves and deconstructing them. A lot of the questions that I've been curious about, so this particular book in the upper left-hand corner, Our Islands and Their People, is a book that I've been doing a lot of my research out of. I feel like the title is pretty self-explanatory. It was put together in 1899, around the time of the Spanish-American War, when the Philippines transitioned from being a colony of Spain to being a colony of the US. And the US put this textbook together as a kind of educational device, and sort of each chapter, it's actually a 2-volume book, and this is a little advertisement from Popular Mechanics from 1911, later past the Spanish-American War, past the Philippine-American War, advertising the purchase of this book as this kind of expedition to be able to get to know these faraway islands through the lens of war correspondents and travelers who went there. This particular book that I've been looking at is presented as this kind of authoritarian historical textbook, and yet it is a myth-making device. It is a construction. It is an invention of landscape and people. And so this particular one the introduction was by a Confederate U.S. soldier or General Joseph Wheeler. And within the textbook, there are these images that I've been looking at. I'll come back to some of these. Some of the images are, as we now sort of call it, documentary style photo, more candid, and others are more portrait style photos where it's clear that the images were taken in a studio. And for me, I became really interested in the portraits because they sort of break this fourth wall. I feel like the books themselves present as authority, as fact, when they're actually fiction. And yet these photos are these constructions, are these inventions, these creations of narrative. And the photos that present more documentary style, although I intellectually understand them to be these curated sections of space, that they in and of themselves have a very particular lens. When I see something that's in a studio, it sort of breaks that fourth wall of like, oh, the photo is constructed. And although this is very obviously constructed, all the other photos in the book are also constructed. And so the caption for each of these portraits usually has a caption that refers to the figure conflating this relationship between race and countenance and disposition and gender. So I've been taking these photos, and I've been primarily curious about this recent project I'll talk to you about the painted, tamed landscapes that are in the background, as well as these fragments of these props, these kind of European-esque props that are there as these kind of places for the figures to sit on or to decorate the background, and all of these sort of myth-making devices to create a sense of place that's very Western oriented to kind of quote unquote civilize the brown bodies that occupy the frame. And for me, all of these photos, when I look at these textbooks, I'm interested in, as similar to what Zavé was saying, what is written between the lines, what is visible beyond the frame, having access, trying to find and have access to the meaning and the stories that are not written, that are not recorded, that I don't have access to in a literal, direct way. And so trying to find that through the making process. Simultaneous to these books, I began to also think about the kind of paradigm of the trope of the explorer who goes into the quote unquote wilds of the jungle, wherever that may be, because in these myths, they're generic, they become one place. And the paradigm of the wildness in the jungle and this lone explorer who goes in to conquer it. This is a painting by Henry Rousseau, which was painted in 1907. He was a French painter who never left France. He was a self-taught artist, and he painted from colonial exhibitions and also from books like the ones that I mentioned before, from botanical gardens and from zoos. So there are these inventions of landscapes, inventions of foreignness in these paintings. And I became particularly interested in the animals that he painted. And I began thinking about, what if this explorer who, I like this image of thinking about the explorer who enters into the jungle and thinks that they're there and are able to conquer the jungle. And then they realize that they've been watched the entire time by this lion that has been camouflaged in the background, that they thought that they were alone, that they thought that they could occupy this space, but that they realize in this moment that this space is already occupied and that they are not in control. So out of this research, the first sculpture I made came out of this question. Going back to the kind of fragments of architectures, I began to think, what would happen if I tried to create a space out of the fragments of the spaces in these photos? What kind of place would I create? And so I ended up creating this sculpture. I ended up using the same kind of language as theater. I wanted to create sculptures that were more like props. And so I used paper mache, and I made these sculptures, and they sort of lived in my studio for about a year. I wasn't sure what to do with them. And then going back to the painting of Henry Rousseau, I began to think that I didn't want to exist outside of the frame any longer. I actually wanted to be able to create this space fully immersed around me and insert my body into it. And my first vision for that was creating a video where I could create this colonial landscape out of the fragments of this colonial architecture that was created in the Philippines, and put myself into that reimagined urban fractured landscape as this feminine, feline, ferocious figure that had reclaimed this space. And I ended up creating this 3-channel video projection. It's hard to see on one screen, but this is a still frame of it. And I'm gonna try and show you one clip. So this is another still frame, and let's see if I can get to. So I'll open up to just one of the sections. So I've edited this version so you can see it at home, but the frames typically is projected on 3 separate walls. gonna skip through to a few other frames within this video just to give you a sense of the arc of the 3 channels, but I won't play through them. So the 3 scenes I just scrolled through briefly, each of the scenes plays simultaneously on the projections, and then my body weaves in and out of the 3 screens in the separate projections within a space. So sometimes you would catch me and sometimes you wouldn't. And the images within each video are very, very slow moving. So I'm gonna just quickly go back to this PowerPoint. I'm gonna stop sharing and then share again because it got stuck. Okay. So after I created the video, I was invited by Jennifer McGregor to do a show at Wave Hill, and I proposed that instead of continuing showing a video there, I really wanted to be able to create the physical space itself. And so I sort of went back to that first sculpture that I showed and that was living in my studio for about a year, and began to create this entire city out of these fragments of photos that were in these textbooks. I also realized that the architecture at Wave Hill has a very similar facade to some of the images of architectures in Manila that were being depicted in these textbooks. And I was really interested in how the international spread of US colonialism is revealed through this architectural thread between different countries. And this is just an image of me in the studio as I was building these sculptures, because at first I went into it thinking that, okay, I'm going to take these textbooks, I want to explode the frame of the photo, I want to understand what's beyond the frame, to understand this space that I don't have access to anymore. And so how can I piece them together and create like this entire world out of these images? And I thought at first that I was just creating building parts to put together this kind of reimagined city. But what ended up happening was I started to develop this very physical relationship to the sculptures. And for example, I would start building a wall and the wall would start to fall onto me. And then I realized that it needed to be activated by my body. And the building parts started to have protrusions and openings and holes and windows and doors for me to crawl through, and bony parts, and began to look rocky. And so I began to think about each of these constructions as sitting in between a building part, a building part, a body part, and part of a landscape. This is an image of an installation shot from Wave Hill. It gets a little bit flattened in photography because of the patterning of the photos to make the sculptures. But just to give you a sense, the floor is papered in the images, the walls are papered in the images, and then the sculptures that you saw previously are suspended from the ceiling and tilted at different angles throughout the space. And throughout this space, I also was collaborating with a Finnish musician named Now, who created this 3-channel soundscape, and the soundscape permeated throughout the installation. I didn't want this installation to stay fixed, to stay static. I wanted it to be a space that was constantly shifting. And so I proposed to the curators to come in every 6 weeks and move the installation around. And because they have visitors that are there who go multiple times, the receptionist would tell me that someone would come in a second time to see the installation, and they would question themselves. They would say, did this move? Did this change? It feels different than it did before. And I really loved that. I love thinking about movement. I love thinking about subtle movement, like tectonic plates, or when you're watching a sunrise or a sunset and you don't see the color changing in front of you, but you turn away and then you look back and you realize that it's completely changed. Like, I love these shifts, these slow shifts that happen that make us question the change. And then we realize that the change has happened after it's quite obvious. Like, I love the process of that. And I loved thinking about that kind of time moving and that kind of shifting in this sculptures. For the closing of this piece, I knew that I wanted to activate the installation with my body. My collaborator, Lau, now flew in from Finland, and this is her setting up for our final performance. I knew that for this final piece that I really wanted to, the concept of deconstructing and reconstructing was incredibly important for me, but I wasn't sure which direction I was going to go in, if I wanted to empty out the space or if I wanted to occupy the space. And so we had a few days ahead of time to sort of figure out which one made the most sense. And my body had a very visceral reaction to the space being cleared. And one of the things that came up for me in studio visits around this project was thinking about these different kinds of perspectives. Like, the textbooks are from a particular perspective, but then in the installation, thinking about different perspectives in space, and this being a kind of bird's eye view of this space and different kinds of lenses that can take. And so what I did for the final closing was I cleared the entire gallery of all the sculptures and I scattered them out across Wave Hill's lawn. And so when you entered into Wave Hill is in the Bronx. It's a botanical garden and it's also a gallery space and a cultural center. So when you entered into the grounds, you would find these strange sculptures that were scattered across the lawn. And the sculptures felt like they belonged back in Wave Hill because they weren't only they don't only contain images from the textbooks that I've been looking at, but they also contain images of Wave Hill itself. And so these sculptures were out on the lawn. And as people came into the performance, they would encounter them. And then what I wanted to do was enter into this space and attempt to physically interact with the space and with the photos as though I could have a physical relationship with them. And so when I came in, I attempted to crawl onto the brick and onto the facades of the buildings and scale the walls and go into the windows and go into the doors and inevitably have an incredibly frustrating experience trying to enter into spaces that my body couldn't enter into. And this kind of performativity felt like an analogous experience to me doing the research and not having access to certain kinds of stories. And then after I scaled the photos, I attempted to reconstruct the installation as quickly as possible. And so I would run out of this space through the actual windows and actual doors and pull the sculptures back into the space and reconstructed it in real time for the viewers who had to navigate with my body and these objects flying into the space. Just want to make sure, how am I doing on time? 1 minute remaining, okay. So I have a short clip that I could share from that. I had some other projects, but I think it would make sense to pause. I'll just quickly show you a small excerpt from the performance.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Zavé. So we're going to move into our Q&A phase now. And there's a question posted for each of you right now. Sarah, could you talk about the musical collaboration? Was it mainly long distance? How did the connection to Finland and its own history of colonialism in the North affect your process at Wave Hill? And for Zavé, could you talk about developing the artifacts for territory? What kinds of sources, reference points you reused, how the collaborative phase of this process has or haven't shifted it? Zavé, do you want to take the question first?
Sure. What kinds of sources are we using? So I primarily have been looking at anthropological documentation of ritual dance in Bali. And also, so sort of to Sarah's thought about reading between the lines, I'm reading it with a very critical kind of multiple eyes as I'm sort of reading through these narratives, because I'm understanding that there's a couple of different ways in which the writer is really disconnected from the culture. My collaborators and I have been actually just looking online and trying to see what we can find. So it's interesting to see that both there are kind of traces and bits and pieces of things, like we'll have Wikipedia, text that will start a thread for us, but then we will kind of look at what's missing from it, and we'll talk about that, or we'll look at, or we'll kind of extrapolate from something. And I think the beauty of working in mythology and that kind of like epic storytelling is that there's a lot of there's kind of a tone of this is, or this is truth, or we know, and so we can kind of insert ourselves we're layering our fictions and histories and what we know into these like little gaps that we find. We're also doing a lot of sort of responsive research. So what the sort of way that our sessions look is that we'll have some research sessions where we'll find fragments of things, text, articles, videos, artistic renderings of the mythologies themselves. We'll watch it together and then we'll just kind of talk through it. It's very like process oriented. And then in our rehearsal time, we kind of take on certain prompts. So we'll kind of respond in a really visceral way. And we've been drawing together, moving together, writing together, and then also collaging our voices together. So if we come up with text individually for our prompt, then sometimes we'll do a collage practice that I like to call it. So we'll start to kind of layer we'll read it individually, and then we'll together as a sort of story circle, we'll start to collage our text so that it becomes like one kind of collective narrative. As I said, I think that there can be these questions about like, what if I don't get the full story of this goddess, for example? And I think for me, I'm really trying to lead us or facilitate us into a process where we're also just intuitively making up the story, because whatever the story is, like all of these stories, whether they're origin stories or sort of stories about foreboding stories too, about like what the consequences of if we sort of enact injustice, like I think that the story is already there. So there's a lot of mashing that's happening. And I'm also excited that my collaborators are kind of taking different mythologies, different fables, different animals. And I think we're going to be able to kind of make this conglomeration that is uniquely ours, coming from these multiple oral histories.
Thank you so much for the question. It's sort of, there's like a long answer and a short answer to the question. I really appreciate what Zavé and I have talked about, and what Zavé, you mentioned briefly in your talk now around practices that allow for intuition and coincidence and things that allow the sort of trust in the body. I feel like my collaboration with Laura happened in that same vein. My husband brought me to a concert of hers last year, and she did this piece at Blank Forms, where she responded to this composer's piece who had recorded sounds from a zoo and then played the sounds back to the animals. And she took those recordings and she created this new kind of soundscape. And as soon as she started to play, I just immediately burst into tears. It had this, I felt like the veil between like what I can see in the physical world and what is invisible to me in the spirit realm just dissolved. It was this incredibly moving piece. And I just went up to her afterwards and just kind of told her how beautiful I thought that it was. And we exchanged information, and we started talking back and forth via email because she lives in Finland, and we started collaborating long distance. I told her about this opportunity, and she was open to exploring it with me. And so we had this sort of back and forth of talking about the core ideas around the project, and me showing her the sculptures and her bringing in her own practice into it. But in terms of how we actually sourced the sounds, it was this combination of collecting field recordings from Wave Hill, sending her video archival footage that was taken in the Philippines, and also asking friends to record writing or poems or based on prompts that I gave them. And Laura would mix them and also blend in sounds from her own country into these field recordings, and made this really incredible multi-channel piece. In terms of the history of Finland, we have not explored that conceptually yet. I think that's a really great question, though. We have a couple of exhibitions coming up this year between 2020 and 2021. And so a lot of our new collaborations could definitely lead to that, and thinking more conceptually about this sort of mutual tie between the two. But as of right now, a lot of the focus has been more about unpacking the history of the Philippines. And but our next project, we are thinking about ways to use sound where the sounds could be activated through movement. And so Laura's been learning how to program Arduinos and thinking about ways that we can incorporate sound, but through these thinking about ways that can be activated in space through movement. So that's what we're working on next.
So there was a question that came up.
For you, Zavé, how do you deal with the absence presence of those that have lived through these stories? How are they brought into these narratives and narrative creation / collaboration?
How do I deal with, sorry, say it one more time.
How do you deal with the absence / presence of those that have lived through these stories? How are they brought into these narratives and narrative creation / collaboration?
Yeah, I think something that comes to mind is the images that I showed of the activation at the Bemis Center in Omaha. I think, you know, my process includes a lot of, you know, fact finding and sort of traditional research, right? But then I think when it comes to actually activating and being in performance, my way of sort of opening up my sensibility is by kind of letting anything come in that needs to come in. And so when I'm performing, I don't so much feel like I'm an actor performing, right? I more so feel that I'm kind of channeling. And I think that a lot of things come in, and it's not necessarily that I know who it is exactly, what their exact experience is, but there's this kind of emotional, empathic charge that happens inside of performances where I do feel like I can connect with a sort of collective historical experience. So when I was in Omaha, I spent a few hours upstairs kind of warming up before the performance itself. And I was singing, and I think singing and vocal work for me just kind of like taps in right away. I assume that is kind of like, for me, this feels kind of like ancestral work in the sense that I'm acknowledging the history of a place that I might just be learning about, and that was the case in Omaha. And I have a practice of really kind of inviting in whoever needs to speak to me while I'm performing, that the channel is open. And I remember the feeling of coming down the stairs of the gallery and the building and coming into the space, and I was really activated. And I had spent a week talking to the curator and other artists, but also doing some sit downs with a local activist and scholar, Taylor Keene, who was driving us around Omaha and basically telling us the missing history, and that is of the Umanhan people, and he is Umanhan Cherokee, and in all this, and he has a farm called Sacred Seed. He co-founded a farm called Sacred Seed, which has been doing replanting indigenous grain, which sort of all kinds of food got wiped out by colonialism, right? So we're not eating like as much biodiverse food as we were before colonization. And so really spending time with Taylor and the other artists and the curator for that week, I was really thinking about everything that he was telling me about. And it really is a learning process for me, right? I'm not like an expert on any of the history that comes into these pieces, but I am a receptacle, or I feel that I want to receive and sort of educate, right, myself and learn. And so I remember walking into the space, into the gallery, really charged. And I don't know, to me, it just feels like there are folks talking, and I feel like I'm responding to that. And so sometimes when I'm singing, the song kind of changes, and I'm kind of just following what I feel is sort of coming into the room. But it's definitely, in a sense, a kind of like multiple body experience. And I receive it also as there's kind of collective emotion that needs to get processed. And I think that dance, performance, music is a space for that. It's kind of a way to feel together, or a way for me as a performer to provoke feeling in an audience, so that the audience can kind of deal with things that we haven't had the time to deal with, So I do think that there's this kind of, there are multiple people in the room with me, and I think we're all kind of conjuring that together. So yeah, it's a very emotive and emotional release process. And the more that I'm learning about ritual dance in Indonesia, the more that I'm understanding that is a tradition that has been around from the beginning. And I'm just kind of approaching it in a way that feels in a way that has come to me, not because I was taught that, but it's really connecting back to all these different performance lineages, which have been around a lot longer than, ballet.
So we are at time, and that's a wonderful note for us to end on. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your artistic practices. Thank you all to the attendees. Thank you to Chris and the BAI and TAPS departments. See you soon.